Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little for Weekly Poker Hand. I'm here with the 18th episode, and so far, all of these hands have been my hands that I have played in mostly major tournaments. But today I want to do something a little bit different and show you a hand that Phil Hellmuth played at the World Series of Poker Europe final table that he played that won him his, I believe it was his 13th bracelet. Maybe it was his 12th, but he has 13 now. I recently did a webinar with Phil Hellmuth, and it was an amazing learning experience for me and also everyone who was involved. But this is one of the hands from that webinar. In that webinar, he discussed all of the major hands he played at that final table and throughout that tournament that let him win. And I think this is a very beneficial hand to watch because I think a lot of players would have misplayed it. So here we are, four-handed. We have a player on the button, who I believe was a loose aggressive guy, raising to two big blinds. The guy in the small blind re-raises to four big blinds, and Phil picks up pocket jacks in the big blind. So I believe Phil had the effective stack, which was about 40 big blinds. So not a ton of chips, but certainly some. I'm sorry, he has 80 big blinds. So the stacks were fairly deep. So in this scenario, I think most people just select to re-raise and see how the hand plays out. But Phil decided to call, and I think calling is actually a good idea because he knows that the player on the small blind who re-raised was a pretty loose, splashy guy. So you really don't want to blow that guy off of his hand. And at the same time, do you really want to re-raise to say 500,000, then have that guy go all in, and then you have to call it off with your jacks four-handed? And as silly as it sounds, I think the answer is no, because whenever there's a raise and a re-raise, it's somewhat easy for one of those two players to have a very strong hand. And believe it or not, jacks does not do amazingly well against very strong hands. So Phil just decides to call, and the initial raiser calls as well. Notice that Phil is comfortable playing this hand three ways. That's not an issue to him. And I don't think it needs to be an issue to you either. Even though both players are going to have some amount of equity, you have to be able to play well after the flop if you're going to be playing in deep stacked poker tournaments, which Phil plays amazingly well after the flop. And as you get more experience with playing well after the flop, you'll start playing better after the flop too. So the player from the small blind bets 275,000, which is around 40% pot on the 9-2-2 flop with two spades. Phil has the jack of spades, jack of hearts. And this is another spot where I think a lot of amateur players would raise. But Phil recognized that if this guy has garbage, I do not want to raise and make him fold. So he decided to just call. And again, he's not worried about the guy yet to act because he almost certainly does not have the best hand. The other guy probably doesn't have the best hand on 9-2-2. Phil has what's close enough to the nuts. This is a scenario where you have to recognize that if Phil raises and then either of the players re-raises him, he should probably fold his jacks. But whenever you have jacks, you really aren't trying to fold. You're trying to get closer to showdown. And Phil knows this. So he called. The turn's a queen of diamonds, which is a bad card for Phil because now the player in the small blind could easily have ace queen, king queen jack, queen seven. Who knows what he could have, but he could have a queen. But that's not a good enough reason to just give it up if he bets. I think you need to be more so looking to get to showdown, as I just suggested. So on the turn, the guy bets 500,000 into a 1.2 million chip pot. And this is starting to become a very pricey hand. I could certainly see Phil's opponent having a very good hand at this point. But the same logic really applies on the turn that applies on the flop, that if Phil raises, he's only going to be getting action when he's crushed. So there's no point in raising. If Phil is going to continue, he has to call and just recognize that if his opponent does have overcards like ace-king, he's going to outdraw him sometimes, and that's okay. Also, if an ace or king does come on the turn and his opponent decides to blast it and bet again, he could conceivably just fold. It's not what you're trying to do, but at the same time, you're trying to conserve chips at the final table while still getting to showdown reasonably often. So the river's a 10, which is a bad river for Phil because now he loses to pocket 10s as well if his opponent happened to be betting with 10s. So notice that Phil loses to any queen, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, any 2 if his opponent happens to have a 2, or aces or kings. So Phil loses to pretty much every value hand at this point. There aren't really any hands that his opponent is going to be betting that Phil beats, besides maybe 10-9, but that's about it. So it's important to note that Phil's hand is a bluff catcher. Even though he has pocket jacks, and pocket jacks are really good before the flop, Phil has a pure bluff catcher. And this is one of these scenarios where your reads come into play. And I'll be the first to admit that Phil has perhaps the best reads in the game. I know he catches a lot of flack from a lot of the more mathematical players who say that he, doesn't know the math of the game, but really he's very smart. And if you view this webinar where he discusses his hand, you will see that he is an absolute genius when it comes to all of this stuff. And this is where Phil put the guy on the bluff. He sometimes you can just look at a guy and tell that he's bluffing. And I know I've had these scenarios. I've been discussing them more recently in a lot of my blogs and share my pair hands and stuff like that. And Phil's webinar actually taught me to trust my reads more, and it's been paying off in dividends for me. I mean, I'm remembering back to this high roller tournament I just played. On day one, I made a big call down with ace high when the guy put me all in on the river, and it won me $13,000 in cash, just like that. And I learned it purely from listening to Phil and recognizing that, my reads are pretty good and I have to trust them if I'm going to be at the super top of the game in poker. I trust my reads pretty much, but sometimes it's just insane, right? But at the same time, sometimes you just know the guy's bluffing, and sure enough, he is. So what does Phil do in the spot? It depends entirely on what he thinks about his opponent, and Phil does decide to call. And I think it's probably an okay call if you have a read that the opponent is bluffing. And sure enough, his opponent was bluffing. Phil wins a nice pot, and he uses this to propel him to victory. So in the webinar, you will actually be able to see me and Phil discussing numerous hands that he played throughout this event, and we will also be going through a lot of the things that he does that he thinks make him one of the biggest winners in the game. And if you want to get good at poker, I strongly suggest you check out this webinar. It was by far the most enlightening experience I've ever had. So if you want to check it out, you can get it at jonathanlittlepoker.com/WSOPE. This was the World Series of Poker event that Phil won. He's going to be reviewing a lot of the hands that he played that let him win his 13th bracelet. So definitely check that out, jonathanlittlepoker.com/WSOPE. And thank you guys very much for watching. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you next week. This has been Jonathan Little for Weekly Poker Hand.